Some people believe that black people should just do better, should just work harder, should just make better choices. They look at the conditions that we live in. They see the poverty, our neighborhoods, the schools, and they say, yeah, slavery was bad, but slavery didn't cause all of this. All of this can't be segregation's fault. That's what some people say. They say it like racial terror and black codes and convict leasing and Jim Crow and lynching and redlining and mass incarceration. Like it just happened. Like nobody meant for it to be this way. But what if it didn't just happen? What if it was designed that way? Built on purpose, structured through law, protected by courts, and normalized by the public. This series is all about that. That injustice against black people was allowed. It was engineered, and sometimes it was even celebrated. It was injustice by design. That's the name of this series. And every story that we will tell will prove the same thing. Injustice wasn't a failure. Injustice wasn't some malfunction of the system. Injustice was the system. This is the first story in this new series, Injustice by Design. And this one is going to be eye-opening for some of you. Because what we're about to uncover is not in most textbooks. It's not taught in schools. And to be honest, it's not supposed to be remembered at all. But that's what the Memory Justice Project is for. To remember what happened to us. To tell the stories that were never meant to be carried forward. And to say their names out loud so that they are no longer forgotten. So I want you to stay with me throughout this video. Because the names we're going to learn, the history that we will uncover, it deserves to be brought to light. These are not just stories of what happened. They are stories of how it was allowed to happen over and over again to people who were supposed to be free, but weren't. In July 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt received a letter at the White House. It was written by a black woman from Bainbridge, Georgia. Her name was Carrie Kinsey. She had exhausted every option she had, and now, with nowhere else to turn, she was writing the President of the United States, hoping that he could help her. In barely literate handwriting, she explained what happened. Her little brother, James Robinson, just 14 years old, had been kidnapped the year before and sold to a plantation. She said that she tried to get help from the police, but they couldn't be bothered. Mr. President, she wrote, they won't let me have him. He has done nothing wrong for them to have him in chains. I need your help. But the president never saw the letter. It was filed away, buried in government archives, where it remains today. Carrie was writing the president about one black boy, but his story wasn't rare. This was happening across the South. Black boys, black men, black girls, black women, stolen back into slavery. Not by night riders, but by courts, by sheriffs, by timber companies, and by the law. Black men who committed no crime except being black and present in a society that still depended on their labor. One of those men was a man named Ned Thompson, an elderly black man in Florida who had escaped slavery and found himself back in it. But to understand what happened to Ned, you have to understand the system that enslaved him. The same system that held Carrie's brother James. Before I get into what happened, I need to give you some history first, because this is an area that people know about, but really don't know about, if that makes any sense. So we've all seen the images of black people in chains, working on plantations. We've seen them recreated in movies and in plays. Black men building roads and laying rail and breaking rocks. But where does this really come from? How do we get here? How do we get to the point where labor and black almost became synonyms? I can tell you this, it was not a mistake. It was by design. There's an old American saying, freedom is not free. And for black people in this country, that could not have been more true. Emancipation comes in 1865. Black people walk out of chattel slavery and step towards citizenship. Or did they? Because suddenly, you have millions of black men and women and children, once legally defined as property, now declared persons, full participants in this great experiment called American democracy. But that raised a question. The South's fields were still there. The cotton still needed picking. The The sugarcane still needed chopping. The railroads still needed laying. The economy, once built on free labor, now lay in ruin. So the question was, who would do the work? Who would rebuild the wealth? And that question shaped everything that came next. Because the answer that America gave was not freedom. It was something else, something designed. The dependency on free labor, or cheap labor, did not end with emancipation. Newly freed black people embraced freedom. They had their own vision for what that freedom should mean. But white planters weren't ready to give up control. The freed were free in mind, but their bodies stayed tied to the land. Slavery had not ended. It had only changed shape. For a moment, though, it looked like there might be a future. In 1866, Congress passed the Southern Homestead Act. It opened government land in Arkansas, in Mississippi, and Alabama, and Louisiana, and Florida to homesteading, for the freed and for whites. And for the first time, black families might have had a chance to steward their own land, to build their own future, to live as free people ought to live in this country. But that hope collapsed almost as soon as it began. The reason the Southern Homestead Act collapsed was because of a catch. Distribution of the land was left to the local officials, the very same men who had been Confederates, who had fought to preserve slavery. In the end, an estimated 4,000 to 4,000 black families received federal land, out of 4 million black people who had been freed after the Civil War. Meanwhile, more than 1.6 million white families, both native and immigrant, were given land. By the year 2000, the descendants of those families number around 46 million people, about 25% of the adult U.S. population. In all, 270 million acres of land were given away. Practically none of it was given to black families. So I'll return to the question I asked a few moments ago. Who was going to do this work? We're not going to give people land. They will not be landowners. They will not have agency. So what happened next? How do we get to Carrie's brother being kidnapped? Almost as soon as we shed the chains of bondage, they came for us, to get us back into the fields. And they weren't shy about it either. This was bold injustice. And here's how they did it. They reorganized farming into tenant farming and sharecropping. On paper, it looked like independence. Work the land, keep a share of the crop, and maybe even build something of your own. But in reality, these contracts were traps. The landowners kept the books, set the prices, and controlled the harvest. And the debt always ran one way. Some former slaveholders didn't even bother with the illusion. They tried to get black people to sign what they called lifetime contracts to work their farms. In South Carolina in 1865, 4 newly freed black people refused to sign such an agreement. 2 lost their lives. A third, a woman, she was tortured. I can't tell you everything I want to in this video because we will literally be here for hours. So I'm going to do my best to summarize this for you. After emancipation, black people were surviving. It was rough, but we were managing. This was the period called Reconstruction. Some historians even have called this the nation's second founding, a chance for the country to finally get it right, to do right by us, black people. This was the era of black politicians, black men serving in the United States Congress, serving in local and state offices. The Freedmen's Bureau was established to help us find our footing, schools and land and institutions. For a brief moment, it looked like citizenship might be possible. But all of that came to an end with what was called the Compromise of 1877, the official end of Reconstruction. In exchange for winning the presidency, Rutherford B. Hayes agreed to withdraw federal troops from the South. That deal gave Southern states the freedom to control their own affairs. And what followed was not freedom at all. It ushered in the era of Jim Crow and racial terror. Across the South, any progress black people had was wiped away. Reconstruction was replaced with black codes. It was replaced with convict leasing, with lynching, and with segregation. Everything that had been promised was rolled back. And what came instead was a system designed to keep us in chains without ever calling it slavery. Remember I just talked about the ways they tried to keep us on the land? Well, after this moment, the end of Reconstruction, when those in power decided that our freedom was not worth losing their power, this is when they went full steam ahead into their program of reenslavement. And they used the very law that emancipated us to re-enslave us. The second founding I just mentioned, it began with the passage of the 13th Amendment, the amendment that abolished slavery. Without the 13th Amendment, slavery would have continued. The Emancipation Proclamation that President Lincoln signed did not by itself abolish slavery. It only set free the enslaved in those areas where Confederates were still in rebellion. But abolition had to be made permanent because a proclamation could be reversed by future presidents or struck down by the courts. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, except it included an exception for those convicted of a crime. If you were a convict, you could be worked like a slave. So all the states had to do was make black people convicts. Enter vagrancy laws. Black people were arrested for petty crimes like loitering and unemployment or walking without proof of work and sold back into slavery. Now, I wish I could talk more about the 13th Amendment and this exception, but it would blow your mind if I told you everything. So I'm not going to get into it right here because that's a story all by itself. I'm going to do another video about that probably sometime later this year. So if you're following me, we've gone from slavery to emancipation and now to abandonment by the federal government. Black people are now fully unprotected, left in the hands of those who only want to enslave us again, who only want to use our labor to build their wealth and their profit. We served no value to them as citizens, only as chattel. That's the roadmap we have here, and I needed to build it so that you can understand what I'm going to tell you next in this story. So again, please stay with me here because we are going somewhere, and you're going to want to hear all of this. All right, so Reconstruction is over. What's the first order of business? Get these black people working again for practically nothing. And how did they do it? Through a system called convict leasing. The very same year as the Compromise of 1877, Florida passed its first convict leasing law. And the timing was no accident. With black people newly stripped of federal protection and white planters desperate for labor, Florida created a system to replace slavery. Under the system, the state had the power to hand over anyone arrested and imprisoned to private companies for profit. 8 years later, in 1885, Florida passed a new constitution. It rolled back most of the rights gained during Reconstruction. It created poll taxes and literacy tests and Jim Crow segregation laws. I mention Florida specifically because that's where the chief characters in our story are. This state, and Leon County in particular, is where we're going to be for the rest of this story. I needed to give you all this history so that you can see the bedrock of injustice that was created just for us and how it came to be. Because at the second part of this story, we're going to have to come back to it and ask some very serious questions. Questions like, who was all of this for? And what was the true purpose of convict leasing? So we know that emancipation created a crisis. Black people were free, and black freedom does not build white wealth, and that had to change. In Leon County, white farmers complained that free black people were idle. They insisted that black labor would collapse without coercion. So as early as 1865, Florida's legislature passed some of the harshest black codes in the South. These laws made things like idleness and vagrancy a crime. This opened the door for sheriffs to arrest anyone deemed to be wandering without work. Courts could then fine the accused, and if the fine couldn't be paid, which was almost always the case for free black people emerged from slavery with nothing, they were auctioned off to the highest bidder. Months of labor, gone. The codes also enforced year-long labor contracts, allowed children of the idle to be apprenticed out, and sanctioned corporal punishment. And if a black person dared to step out of line, to leave a plantation, to refuse a contract, or to be simply unemployed, they risked arrest, sale, and forced labor all over again. Florida planters and corporations were so committed to this system that even after Florida officially ended state-level leasing in 1919, counties like Leon kept their own systems alive. The counties and local officials had no plans to give up this money, the money being made off of our reenslavement. Leon County was a place that had a long love relationship with slavery and black labor. Located in the Florida Panhandle, it was one of Florida's richest regions before the Civil War. The wealth was acquired on cotton plantations, worked by enslaved black people. The value of enslaved black people in Leon County exceeded the value of the land itself. Black bodies were the central form of wealth. So it made sense that Leon County wanted to continue convict leasing. Why stop a good thing? Working black people as slaves had been good to the people there for over a century. In 1921, the Leon County Sheriff's Office made a contract with the Putnam Lumber Company, a Wisconsin-owned timber corporation that had camps all across Florida. The deal was simple. Supply prisoners at $20 per person per month. The jail pocketed about $15 per man after expense. A steady income stream. And the numbers tell the story. In the 7 months before the Putnam Lumber Company deal, Leon County recorded only 20 arrests for vagrancy. In the 7 months after the deal, the number jumped to 154. One of those arrested was a 64-year-old black man named Ned Thompson. We don't know much about Ned Thompson's history. The records just aren't there. But we will do our best to give him dignity and tell his story in a way that humanizes him and doesn't focus solely on the injustice that he suffered. Ned was born around 1857. That means he likely experienced enslavement as a child and was freed after the Civil War, which would have put him around 8 years old when emancipation came in 1865. Like many black men in the region, Ned likely spent most of his life working on the land, laboring in the fields of those who once owned black people. By 1921, Ned was around 64 years old and just trying to survive. Now, remember I said that Leon County had that contract with the Putnam Lumber Company. Well, Ned's body was needed for that contract. On September 9, 1921, Ned was arrested under a peace warrant. This was one of the many unjust legal tools used to capture black people. It was a vestige of the black codes and vagrancy laws that emerged at the end of slavery. Laws that criminalized every aspect of black life. Laws that made it a crime to be unemployed, a crime to be in transit, a crime to be standing still, a crime to be black and alive. Ned was arrested by Sheriff John R. Jones, a mean man, a man once described as little better than a slave catcher. But he knew his job, and he knew it well. Black bodies were how he made his money. Because remember, the jail profited $15 per person that they captured and sold to the Putnam Lumber Company. And here's where I need you to throw out everything you know from Law and Order. Throw out the courtroom dramas. Throw out the first 48. Throw it all out. Because due process and the rule of law, they were not here. Not for black people. Remember, this system was injustice, not legal process. There were no public defenders, no arraignments, no continuances, no motions filed. Just injustice. Period. That's the reality that we're dealing with here. That's the reality that Ned was dealing with. Ned was thrown in jail with no formal charges. Now, under Florida law, he should have been allowed to serve his sentence locally, but he was not given that choice. On September 21st, he was transported to the Clara Putnam Lumber Company camp in Dixie County, Florida. The sheriff got his money, the jail got their cut, and Ned was sent off for more injustice, more slavery. Here was this black man, 64 years old, born a slave, survived the birth and the rise of the Klan, lived through the abandonment of protection after Reconstruction. And here he was, being sent to a prison camp, a senior citizen. I mean, can you imagine this? And not for some capital crime either, not as a fugitive on the run. Ned's charge was so make-believe that even now, over 100 years later, we can't say what he was actually accused of. His crime was being black. And here's the thing that you must remember. We're talking about Ned, but Ned was one of thousands. I mean, no black man was safe. This is what black life was like. To wake up in the morning, to leave your home, and never come back because you were arrested for standing. To know that some people hated everything about you, despised your joy, resented your peacefulness, your laughter, your smile, your walk, your voice. Your very existence was hated. Being black was your crime, and being black was your punishment. Our ancestors lived this reality, and I wonder, what went through Ned's mind? I can almost hear him saying, "Sir, I don't know anything about a warrant. Sir, I'm just trying to get back to my family. I only came out today for one thing. I promise I won't be any trouble. I have a job, sir. I'm not one of them. I work on Mr. Locket's plantation. If you could just go and talk to him, he'll tell you. He'll vouch for me, I swear. Please. My wife is waiting on me to come back." Can you hear it? Hear Ned pleading? Hear this black man begging for his life, for his family, for his freedom? Pleading for mercy? in a system that never once saw him as deserving of it? And think about that. In the biblical sense, mercy is a gift. It is something that you do not deserve. You're spared. The punishment is held back from you out of mercy. That's why the old gospel song says, "Your grace and mercy brought me through." And as a lawyer, if I'm representing a criminal defendant, I might stand before the judge at a sentencing hearing and say, "Your Honor, we're at the mercy of the court." But Ned was begging for mercy for a crime that he did not commit, for a punishment that he did not deserve. Justice is what you deserve. And justice demanded that Ned be allowed to live his life. And going back to the old gospel song, if you know it, you know there's a line that says, "Justice demanded that I should die." But for Ned, justice demanded that he should not be facing reenslavement, that he should be free, that he should be treated justly. Justice demanded that he should be treated with dignity, that he not be relegated to second-class citizenship. Justice demanded that he not be snatched off the street as if he had no rights at all. That's what justice demanded. But here he was, begging for mercy, because justice was unavailable to him. And not just to Ned, but to all black people. No justice and no mercy. And now, as we turn back to Ned, see him walking into their prison camp. See him surrounded by black men, many already there, and more coming in with him. In the next chapter, the story gets worse. More injustice, more cruelty, without mercy. Ned was now back in slavery. The boy who had been emancipated in early childhood was now enslaved in old age. The cleric camp was not just a lumber operation. It was slavery. It was worse, actually, because during slavery, you couldn't work your slaves to death. A slave owner had a mortgage on his slaves. If one died, he was out of money and owed the bank. But here, when one man died, they simply brought in another one. There was no incentive for moderation, only maximum labor. And you only get maximum labor through maximum brutality. The system Ned was entering was designed to break men down. Camps were deliberately remote, built to isolate men and cut off any chance of escape. Prisoners slept in rough board shacks with tin roofs and no windows. Their bodies already weakened from poor food and swamp labor. And into this system walked 64-year-old Ned Thompson, an old black man, already weary from survival, now forced into the same brutality that was breaking men half his age. We don't know everything about this particular camp or its exact conditions, but we do know what went on at camps just like this one. Ned would have started his days before sunrise and ended them long after the sun went down. He would have been sent into waist-deep swamp water, mosquitoes biting, snakes filling the water, forcing men to step carefully to avoid their strike. Thick mud clinging to his feet with every step, weighing him down as he hauled cypress or cut logs. The air heavy with humidity, the sting of sweat in his eyes, the sound of axes striking wood all around him. This was hell, and we have to call it what it was. But those weren't just the physical conditions, the ones the environment created. Because remember, Ned was back in slavery, and slavery had one hallmark, one central feature that defined the black experience under it: brutality, the lash, the beating, the violence that was not occasional, but constant and expected and designed. And Ned was about to face it. The prison camp was under the control of a man named Thomas Walter Higginbotham, the camp's whipping boss. That's what they called him, and that's what he was. Higginbotham was full of rage and hatred and savagery. He was feared by every man in the camp, both black and white alike. He believed in his position. He believed in his name, the whipping boss, because that's how he carried out his duties, by whipping convicts. He used a leather strap, 4 inches wide, 7.5 pounds heavy, to beat men into submission. You didn't work? You got beat. You looked the wrong way? You got beat. You breathed too hard? You got beat. Everything was a reason. Every moment was a risk. Under Higginbotham, pain was the rule, and brutality was the law. Remember, Ned was 64 years old. And 64 then was not 64 now. This was a 64 that had carried slavery, a 64 that had lived through the Klan, through Reconstruction, and through Jim Crow. For black people in that time, life expectancy was far lower than it is today. 64 could have easily been 84 or 94, even 104. And here he was, an old man's body, forced to endure the brutality of this labor camp. And it was in that state that Higginbotham came for him, because Ned wasn't working fast enough. And for Higginbotham, that was reason enough. So the whip came down. That leather strap, 4 inches wide, 7.5 pounds heavy, came crashing across Ned's back. Between each strike, Higginbotham would drag the strap through sand or sugar. Sand turned the leather into an abrasive so that every blow didn't just strike, it tore. Sugar cut like tiny blades, and when pressed into the wounds, it burned like fire. And this is where I have to stop, because the research tells us what Higginbotham did, but it does not tell us what Ned felt. Try to hear Ned's voice in this moment. Him saying, "What am I doing here? What is happening? Why is he doing this to me? My God, I don't want to die." Or, "God, take me now." This is one of those moments where I ask you to stop and to just slow down, to go back there, go back to the camp, see Ned, practically naked, 64 years old, screaming and crying and pleading, his back ripped open, bloody, and see Higginbotham, not caring, delivering strike after strike after strike, and see the other black men watching in horror. And remember, Ned would not have been the only one. There would have been others. Grown men crying. This was not discipline. This was not correction. This was terror by design. And Ned, a 64-year-old black man, was his target. The violence that Ned endured was not new. It was born from a long history of violence against black people. Under slavery, no law said you couldn't whip your slaves. And under convict leasing, the law still said you could whip the convicts. Different system, same brutality, same outcome for black people. And that's exactly what Thomas Walter Higginbotham carried out. He was not just a man with a strap. He was the old logic of slavery, repackaged in the new system. At Clara Camp, he stood where the overseer once stood, and he carried out his duties the same way, through violence, through terror, and through the lash. Remember, freedom had a cost, a price to pay. And Higginbotham, he collected it every single day at that prison camp. Collected it from Ned. After the beating, Ned could not work. Higginbotham had broken him. His body physically could not go anymore. And in that camp, if you could not work, you were no good. So Ned was taken back to jail, because if a man was too sick or too fragile to work, he was made to simply sit in the jail cell until he recovered enough to be sent back to the camp, or worse, until he died. Ned sat in that jail cell with no medical help, no care, no concern for his well-being. Just like during slavery, he was expected to just get better so he could be worked again. But Ned did not get better. With each passing day, he grew worse. His body began to shut down. His strength failed. His life was slipping away. And sometime in October or November of 1921, Ned Thompson died in the Leon County Jail. Now, this moment really struck me. Not simply because Ned had died in such a brutal way, and I don't mean to minimize it. What I mean is this. Ned had been through so much. He had seen so much. He had survived so much. Slavery. Ned was enslaved. I need you to really hear this. Ned Thompson was enslaved, and he survived it. He belonged to that one generation of black people who walked out of chains and into freedom, something only one generation will ever get to do. He was someone who heard the first rumblings of a group called the Klan before they perfected their regalia of terror, something only one generation of black people would ever see. He was there when they created black codes and vagrancy laws and the very tools that later became known as mass incarceration, something only one generation of black people would ever witness. He lived long enough to remember when Jim Crow was still perfecting his craft, when he was little Jimmy, when the first white-only signs were nailed up, when the Supreme Court declared that separate but equal was the law of the land, something only one generation of black people would ever see. And here he was, decades later, being beaten like it was 1821 and dying alone on a jail cell floor, like he was nothing. This black man has seen things we only read about. An entire story of black suffering and black resilience and black determination lived inside of Ned until Higginbotham beat it out of him. What struck me was not that Ned died, it was what died with him. A whole generation's memory, a whole people's story. And if we don't keep telling it, it dies again. After Ned died, the official reason given for his death was he died of tuberculosis. There was no mention that the whipping boss had beaten him to death. These lies were commonplace in Florida's convict leasing records, where black people died from abuse, but their deaths were disguised as illness. It protected the officials. It protected the system. It protected the lie. Ned Thompson was buried in an unmarked grave. No one was ever supposed to know about him or what happened until another man entered the story, a white man. And this is the part of the story that we've been building toward, right here. And I'm going to ask you to stay with me here, because Ned's life may be over, but his story is not. And what happens next answers the question I posed at the beginning. What if injustice against black people wasn't accidental? What if it was designed? And this next part of the story will show exactly how it was designed. Ned was gone, buried in an unmarked grave, his story silenced. But then came another man, a white man named Martin Tabert. And what happened to him would expose everything that this system was built on. Because this right here, this is what injustice by design is all about. And we're about to see the lie exposed. The lie of injustice, the lie of racism, the lie that said that it was acceptable to treat black people this way. Let me tell you about Martin Tabert and how what happened to him exposed this lie. Martin Tabert was 22 years old, the son of a well-to-do German-American farming family from Munich, North Dakota. His parents, Benjamin and Katie Tabert, owned a 560-acre farm, and Martin was supposed to help on that farm. But after World War I, one of his brothers came back from overseas and returned to work the land. So Martin thought that he would take a trip. He had some money, and his plan was simple. Work part-time, see the sights, and move from place to place. In the summer of 1921, he left North Dakota, riding freight trains and picking up odd jobs. By December, he was running low on money, and he ended up in Florida. On December 15, 1921, just a few months after Ned's death, Martin was caught stealing a ride on a train in Florida. In Leon County, that offense was charged as vagrancy, the very same crime that allowed sheriffs and judges to keep a steady supply of convict labor flowing to private companies. The same law that proved deadly for Ned was now following a white man from a wealthy northern family. In a sham late-night proceeding, typical of Leon County, Judge B.F. Willis fined Martin $25. But Martin had no money to pay, so he was sentenced to 90 days of hard labor. And Sheriff John R. Jones stepped right in, collected his money, and sent Martin to the Clara Putnam lumber camp, the very same camp where Ned was sent just a few months earlier. Martin had no idea what he was in for. Once at the camp, Martin wired his family in North Dakota for money. They sent $75, more than enough to cover his fine and secure his release. But Sheriff Jones refused it. He returned the payment, stamped with the words, "Party gone." No Martin, no money for the sheriff. And this shows you just how vicious this system was. You couldn't pay your way out. Once you were in it, you were trapped. The same trap that swallowed Ned now had Martin. Martin wrote home. He knew he shouldn't be there. He knew his crime didn't fit the punishment. And I'm sure he thought to himself, I'll get out of this. My family can send the money. They'll get me out of here. But what about Ned? What about all the other Neds? All the black men and women caught up in this horror machine. Who did they have to write to? Who would pay their fines? Who would come to their rescue? Because that's what so many black families did. They wrote, they pleaded, they hoped someone would answer. And every time I think about that, I'm reminded of the film Sounder, starring Cicely Tyson and Paul Winfield. Now, don't worry if you've never seen it. It's from 1972. This is way back. In the film, Nathan Lee, played by Paul Winfield, ends up in a prison camp in Louisiana, and his son, David, goes on a journey to find him. Cicely Tyson's character, Rebecca, just wants to know that her husband will be okay and when he'll come home. Many black families felt the same way when their fathers and their brothers and their sons were kidnapped back into slavery. They believed he shouldn't be there, but there was no amount of money that could bring them home. And that was Martin's mistake. He thought his family's wealth could buy his freedom. But once he got close enough to Jim Crow's cash-generating machine, he found out what Ned already knew. You suffered like every other man trapped in this system. Martin was now at the Clara camp in Dixie County, the camp of suffering, of pain, horror, and brutality. The same camp that stole Ned from this world. Martin was put to work just like Ned had been. But Martin was 40 years younger than Ned, and even he couldn't keep up with the labor. Day after day in the swamp was too much for him. First, his feet began to swell. Then, a painful infection developed in his groin, so severe that the camp doctor had to cut it open, a crude and agonizing procedure. He grew weaker by the day, too weak to stand. He trembled at the work site. By mid-January 1922, Martin was no match for the slave conditions of the Clara camp. And one day, while working on the railroad, he slowed down. The whipping boss, Thomas Walter Higginbotham, saw him, and that was all it took. Higginbotham had no tolerance for anything that even looked like defiance. And make no mistake, in this system, slowing down for a half a second was defiance. Higginbotham wasted no time. He ordered Martin to be corrected, the same way Ned had been. Out came the 4-inch wide, 7-pound leather strap. Martin was beaten in front of everyone to see. And just like with Ned, the beating was too much. Martin grew worse with each passing day. The camp doctor, T. Capers Jones, did nothing to help him. And 4 days later, on February 1st, 1922, Martin Tabert was dead. And just like with Ned, the official record was a lie. He said he died of pneumonia with malaria complications. Now, this was all supposed to move on like nothing had ever happened. I looked it up. February 1st, 1922 was a Wednesday. This was supposed to be just another Wednesday. Martin's death was supposed to fade into the routine of injustice. I'm sure he wasn't even the only man who died at the camp that month after a severe beating. No one was supposed to care about what happened to him, but someone did care. His name was Glenn Thompson. Glenn had seen Martin's beating and couldn't stay silent. He sent a message to Martin's family back in North Dakota. He knew Martin was from Munich, so he wrote to the postmaster there and tried to find out if anyone knew his parents. The postmaster forwarded the letter to them, and when Martin's parents received it, they immediately wrote back, begging for answers. Glenn replied. He told them everything, every detail, exposing the lie told by Sheriff Jones and the Putnam Lumber Company. Unlike Ned, and unlike the countless black families who endured the same pain, Martin's family was not just going to take it and move on. They were white, not black. They had money, power, and connections. Jim Crow wasn't just going to take their boy's life and move on quietly. So the Taberts sought help. They reached out to Gudmundur Grimson, the state attorney for Pembina County in North Carolina. Grimson agreed to investigate on their behalf. In January of 1923, he traveled all the way to Florida, interviewing witnesses, collecting sworn statements, reviewing court and camp records. What he found was a trail of brutality, corruption, and contradiction. The official story did not hold. The death reported by Martin was a lie. By mid-1923, the truth had reached the front pages of newspapers all across this nation. Florida's entire convict leasing system, its economic and political foundation, was now under threat. And that national attention created an opening for other buried stories to surface, including one name that had been forgotten, Ned Thompson. The outrage over Martin Tabert's death was swift. It crossed state lines. It made headlines. It demanded answers. But only for Martin. And that's why this next part of the story matters. because it's going to answer that question we posed at the very beginning. Was injustice against black people a malfunction of the system, or was it the system itself? Let me tell you how quickly outrage over Martin's death turned into action, into every lever of state and federal power working to correct this wrong. The North Dakota legislature unanimously passed a resolution demanding that Florida investigate Martin's conviction, his leasing, and his death. I mean, can you believe that? A state nearly 2,000 miles away could force Florida's hand, something that the families of black victims like Ned Thompson could never do. On April 10, 1923, in Madison, Florida, a legislative hearing began. Glenn Thompson testified, telling what he saw. Jerry Popple, a former jailer, he also took the stand. He spoke about how men were arrested and tried in the dead of night by a drunk judge and a drunken official. The legal process was reduced to theater, a shameful ritual of power, meant to remind those caught in the system that the state could take your freedom at any hour without reason and without sobriety. Sheriff Jones himself admitted to his $20 per head arrangement with the Putnam Lumber Company, turning human bodies into streams of income. Thelma Franklin, a white woman, the postmaster's wife, and the local storekeeper, said she was testifying for the sake of humanity and to allow the people of the country to know the real truth. She revealed that a state senator, T.J. Knapp, ran a camp where people were brutally beaten. And she had something even more horrifying, that Mary Sheffield, a black woman, who was scheduled to testify about Senator Knapp's camp, her life was taken, along with her daughter. Florida's governor, Kerry Hardy, and the state legislature moved quickly. Sheriff Jones and Judge Willis were removed from office. And the legislature went one step further, passing a bill that prohibited corporal punishment for being used on convicts. By January of 1925, Florida officially confirmed to North Dakota that it had abolished its county convict leasing and banned the whip, at least on paper, that is, because Florida would soon find new ways to work men to death. But still, there was more. Sheriff Jones and the whipping boss, Thomas Walter Higginbotham, were both indicted and prosecuted. Higginbotham went to trial first in June of 1923. He was found guilty of taking Martin's life and sentenced to 20 years in prison. But the next year, the Florida Supreme Court overturned that conviction on a technicality. A second trial was had in July of 1925. And this time, Higginbotham was found not guilty. He went right back to work for the Putnam Lumber Company. That same year, he was indicted again for taking the life of another black laborer, Lewis Peanut Barker. And once again, nothing came of it. As for Sheriff Jones, he too was never held accountable. There's one more part of the story that you need to know. Martin's family sued the Putnam Lumber Company, and the company settled for $20,000. That's nearly $400,000 today. But what about Ned's family? Did they get anything for what happened to him? What about all the other black men who suffered under Sheriff Jones and Judge Willis and Higginbotham? What did they get? I'll tell you, they got nothing, because that's how they were seen, as nothing, as nobodies. Just one more body in the machinery of slavery and black injustice. One dies, get another. That was the business model. Work them until they die, because they were black. Nothing was owed to them, no justice, no dignity, not even memory. But we give them that today. We give it to Ned. We give it to Kerry Kinsey's brother. We give it to all the black men and black women that they wanted forgotten in unmarked graves, silenced by racism, buried by injustice. We're going to resurrect their story. That is what this Memory Justice Project is all about. That is what we're doing. Who is going to tell their story? Who is going to give them dignity? Can I say it another way? In this present time, who is going to tell the truth? Who is going to hold the line for truth? Who is going to stand on the wall for truth? Are you going to do it? Who is going to say Ned Thompson was here and what happened to him was real? So I'm going to close the same way I opened this video. Some say black people should just do better. They should work harder. They should make better choices. They look at the conditions we live in, the poverty in the neighborhoods and the schools, and they say, Slavery and segregation did not cause all of this. That's what some say. They say it like racial terror and black codes and convict leasing and Jim Crow and lynching and redlining and mass incarceration, as if it just happened, like nobody meant for it to be this way. But we know better, don't we? Ned Thompson and Martin Tabert's stories prove it didn't just happen. Injustice against us, it was structured, it was thought out, it was well planned, it was devised. It was injustice by design, all with the singular focus of ensuring we stayed on the bottom. And if you doubt it, look at the evidence. The moment it touched them, the moment it swallowed one of their own, the moment black suffering struck white peace, they changed the entire system. But they never changed it for Ned or for any other black person. They just found new ways to modify it, to perfect it. In these present times, when it seems like black people are being blamed for the injustice that was inflicted upon us, when we're being punished for the suffering that was designed for us, when our names and our history are being erased because they make some uncomfortable, do not be discouraged. Do not be distressed, because I want you to remember this. Truth is truth. What happened to us was real. What is happening to us is real. The conditions of the plantations we labored in were real. The conditions of our community presently are real. Convict leasing was real. Mass incarceration is real. And it's up to each and every one of us to make sure that we keep telling the truth. This was the first story in our Injustice by Design series, but there are still more names, more stories to learn, more truth to uncover. But before we get there, I want to hear from you. What did you think about Ned's story? What did you learn? What made you pause and think? Let me know in the comments. And as always, thank you for joining me on this journey as we tell our story. See you in the next video. God bless you and God keep you.